Welcome everyone to today's Explainer. Today, we're digging into a massive, honestly kind of wild shift happening all across the globe. On one side of the coin, you have major shakeups in global geopolitics and international infrastructure. On the completely opposite side, you've got local PC gamers tweaking their custom rigs to squeeze out every single frame per second. So, what exactly binds these two totally different worlds together? Well, it's the rapidly accelerating transition away from proprietary operating systems straight towards open source alternatives. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our agenda for today. 1. The fall of Windows. 2. The push for digital sovereignty. 3. But can Linux game? 4. CPU-limited gaming benchmarks. And 5. The open source future. Section 1. The fall of Windows. From reliable workflows to modern bloat. To really understand why whole nations and hardcore gamers are looking elsewhere, we first got to look at how the user experience has evolved over the last 15 years. Think back to 2009. Windows 7 was pretty much universally loved. It was clean, it was functional, it was reliable, it just stayed out of your way. But then, 2012 rolls around and Microsoft drops Windows 8, introducing that completely touch-focused start screen disaster on desktop PCs. In 2015, Windows 10 brought the start menu back, sure, but it also brought baked-in telemetry and automatic tile installations for games like Candy Crush that absolutely no one asked for. Fast forward to 2021 with Windows 11, and users are dealing with even more baked-in ads, Copilot AI bloat being pushed everywhere, and those strict hardware restrictions like the TPM 2.0 requirement that literally locked out millions of perfectly capable PCs. The whole ecosystem just kind of drifted from simple functionality to forced updates and this overarching feeling of lost control. And this fatigue isn't just some subjective feeling among angry users on Reddit. Even Microsoft seems fully aware of it. According to leaked reports, Microsoft has actually created an internal initiative, codenamed K2, to rebuild the start menu, remove ads, and make Windows up to 60% faster. When a massive tech giant has an internal initiative dedicated strictly to de-bloating its own operating system to win back users, it's a pretty clear admission that the software has become bogged down by its own legacy debt. Section 2. Push for digital sovereignty. Governments ditching proprietary ecosystems. Now let's pivot from the individual user's frustration to the massive scale of national infrastructure, because this is where the open source shift gets seriously significant. Take a staggering number like 2.5 million. That is the number of French government PCs reportedly moving away from the Microsoft Windows ecosystem over to an open source Linux system. This is a monumental shift for one of the world's leading economies. We aren't just talking about a software update. This is a fundamental infrastructure replacement. So, the crucial point is, why are they doing this? Well, it all comes down to a concept called digital sovereignty. This means having full control over your own data, systems, and technological infrastructure without relying on external powers or foreign corporations. In our current geopolitical climate, governments are realizing that heavily relying on software controlled by American tech giants is a massive vulnerability. Think about it. If your entire nation's administration runs on a proprietary platform, you're essentially at the mercy of that corporation's strategic decisions, their pricing models, their security protocols, not to mention the broader political relations between nations. And this isn't just some theoretical, small-scale pilot program. If we look at the French Linux implementations, the scale is just incredible. The National Health Insurance Fund already shifted 80,000 employees over. The French National Police, they've actually been using their own custom Linux distribution called Ubuntu for 20 years across 100,000 PCs. The new broad government desktop is likely going to be Ubuntu-based, coming preloaded with open-source staples like LibreOffice. Furthermore, they've even dropped Microsoft Teams in favor of a French-developed open-source encrypted communication alternative. This definitively proves that Linux is stable and mature enough to handle the daily workflows of entire government ministries. Section 3. But can Linux game? Bridging the gap from government workstations to home PCs. So, we've established that Linux is robust enough for a country's critical infrastructure. But let's bring the narrative back down to the micro level. If it's good enough for the French government, is it good enough to run on your custom gaming rig without giving you a massive headache? For a long time, the barrier to entry for Linux gaming was launcher friction, just trying to get things like Ubisoft Connect or the EA app to actually launch. But today, playing Ubisoft Connect games on Linux takes 4 incredibly simple steps. Step 1, open your distribution's software center and download an application called Lutris. Step 2, search for Ubisoft Connect within Lutris and install it via Wine, which is just a compatibility layer. Step 3, sign into your Ubisoft account like normal. Step 4, check a site called ProtonDB for your specific game's compatibility rating, hit play, and you are good to go. It proves the days of needing a computer science degree to play PC games on open source systems are completely over. Section 4, CPU Limited Gaming Benchmarks, CauchyOS versus Bazzite versus Windows 11. Let's move to the hard data and see how this builds into actual gaming performance. We are testing the absolute limits of these operating systems using some of the most demanding games available. The benchmark setup parameters are super important here. The tester specifically chose a 1080p resolution. Why? Well, because this ensures the graphics card is not the bottleneck. It forces the CPU to be the limiting factor, which perfectly isolates the operating system's processing efficiency. The test PC used a quad-core CPU, and all OS installs were totally clean with no special tweaks. We're comparing the reigning champion, Windows 11, against two popular Linux distributions, the Arch-based, highly optimized CauchyOS and the gamer-focused Bazzite. Now, what's really interesting about this data is the average frames per second in a highly demanding title like Cyberpunk 2077. CauchyOS actually takes the lead with an average of 76 frames per second. Windows 11 comes in second at 72, and Bazzite trails slightly at 65. So, in a strictly CPU-limited scenario, a modern, optimized Linux distribution didn't just tie Windows, it actually outperformed it in one of the most notoriously heavy games on the market today. And the plot thickens even more when we look at the 1% lows, which, as you know, measure the most severe frame drops and stuttering. In Marvel Rivals, using external overlay data, CauchyOS totally dominated with a score of 22, compared to Windows 11 at 16 and Bazzite at 14. However, there is a fascinating catch to this specific data point that reveals just how complex benchmarking different operating systems can be. It all comes down to the loading screen impact. The benchmark for this specific game tests several scenes, and it takes a few seconds to load between them. The external overlay software continues to capture performance during those loading screens. And because Windows and Linux handle loading new scenes differently, Windows dropped way more frames during the black loading screens, which artificially dragged down its overall 1% low overlay score. When looking purely at the in-game benchmark tool that ignores loading screens, Windows and CauchyOS were actually in a dead heat, essentially a technical tie. It's a great reminder to always look under the hood of these benchmarking numbers. But setting aside raw frame rates for a moment, here is a massive question you should take away from all this data. Why does Linux use so much less VRAM? Because this was a major, surprising advantage that just kept popping up across multiple titles. In a direct resource allocation showdown, the differences are just stark. Look at Red Dead Redemption 2. Linux utilized roughly 3 gigabytes less VRAM than Windows to achieve similar performance. 3 gigabytes! In Cyberpunk 2077, it used over a gigabyte less. And in Counter-Strike 2, running natively, Windows used roughly 50% more system RAM than Linux. These massive VRAM savings, particularly in games like Red Dead, are likely due to the highly efficient Vulkan API, which is the default for Linux gaming. When your system is hoarding less memory just to run the OS and manage graphics, that obviously leaves way more horsepower for your actual applications and games. Section 5. The Open Source Future. What this macro and micro shift means for you. Let's zoom back out and tie this all together. What connects a gamer choosing CauchyOS for better frame rates to a nation switching millions of PCs to Ubuntu? It becomes pretty clear when we directly compare the ecosystems. On the proprietary side, Windows is increasingly characterized by telemetry, baked-in ads, corporate control over updates, and a heavy legacy debt that drags the system down. But on the open source side, the Linux ecosystem is defined by user privacy, digital sovereignty, deep customization, and, as we saw with CauchyOS, streamlined speed. The French government's desire for absolute control over its own infrastructure perfectly mirrors the PC gamer's desire for a bloat-free, efficient system that actually respects their hardware. And this brilliantly illustrates the core philosophical shift driving all of this. To quote an analysis of the geopolitical situation, if your payment systems, your energy grid, or your weapons run on tech you can't fix or control, the provider has a potential kill switch. Whether you're looking at national security or simply the right to own and operate your personal computer without forced AI integrations, the sentiment is exactly the same. Control matters. So we really have to ask, with governments proving its massive scale and independent benchmarks proving its bleeding-edge gaming speed, is the era of default Windows dominance finally fracturing? It's a fascinating shift, and I hope this explainer has given you the context to see the bigger picture. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these amazing open source projects for yourself.